Hello, this is Malachi Bishop, professor with the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at the University of Kentucky. And this is Rehab Counseling 650, Rehab Counseling Theories and Techniques, Section 1. Today we're going to be talking about our first theory, and we're going to be talking about psychoanalysis, originally developed by Sigmund Freud. Couple of questions we're going to start with today before we get into psychoanalysis. This is, as I said, we'd be starting at the beginning with Sigmund Freud, who really developed and started talking and writing about this theory in the late 1800s. And so the question is, does this theory, developed over a century ago, still have relevance for us today, and does psychoanalysis offer rehabilitation counselors in particular a useful theoretical framework for practice? These are questions that, when we're finished, you can decide. A lot of people think the answer is yes. Some people think the answer is no. If you look at recent surveys of counselors and psychologists, where they ask which theory of personality, of counseling, of psychotherapy do you adhere to, a very small percentage actually claim psychoanalysis. 1 or 2% among counselors generally, and just a little higher among psychologists. But what you will see, even though there aren't too many, especially rehabilitation counselors, who identify themselves primarily as psychoanalysts or psychoanalytic counselors, I guess so the question is, why are we talking about Freud? And the answer is, one answer is that even though not a lot of us consider ourselves psychoanalytic counselors, what I think you will see is that a lot of the ideas that Freud developed have shown themselves to be important, and a lot of the contributions that Freud made are still very much with us today. So we'll come back to that question. But first, let's talk a little bit about Sigmund Freud and his life. As I said in the introduction, we're going to spend a little time learning about each of the theorists, their lives and times, and what was going on as a means of understanding the theory that they eventually developed. So Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia, which is in the current Czech Republic. Moved when he was just a child to Vienna. His family moved to Vienna, and he spent most of his life there. Freud died in London in 1939 at the age of 83. He was the oldest of 7 children to his parents, Jacob and Emily. And Emily was actually Jacob's second wife and was 20 years younger than her husband when they were married. She was 21 years old when she had Sigmund. And then she had the couple had 6 other children. But Sigmund was the oldest, and it turns out that Sigmund was actually, appears to have been something of a favorite. Emily, Sigmund Freud's mother, referred to him as her golden Siggy, and Sigmund was the only sibling to have his own room, sort of had a special place in the family. He was certainly a precocious student, very intelligent man, really had a brilliant mind in a number of ways. He started high school at the age of 10 years old, started med school at age 17, and finished with a specialization in neurology at the age of 25. thinking about what was going on in the period of his life that might have influenced his theory and its development. As I said, Sigmund was a brilliant man. Apparently, had a photographic memory. Extraordinary student. But the other thing you need to know about Freud is that it appears that he was a person who was driven to become well known. Basically, and I think you can attribute this to his place in his family, but you get the sense that he was a person who expected eventually to become well known, and he made a lot of efforts at doing this and had a number of successes in different areas. In the area of medicine, he made a number of important discoveries. For example, one time he dissected 400 eels to prove for the first time that eels had testes. He developed a gold chloride cell staining technique for the study of cells. He worked on the idea of contact barriers between neurons and the idea that the nerves communicate with each other. And he was actually ahead of his time in his thinking in that area, anticipating the idea that we now understand as the synapse between neurons. Discovered cocaine could be used as an anesthetic, and as you probably know, spent some time studying the effects of cocaine on himself. But in the world at the time that Sigmund Freud was becoming a professional, some of the key ideas that you can see influencing his eventual theory, physics, first of all, was very prevalent at the time, and the idea of energy and electricity and mass and systems and energy transfer, those sorts of ideas very prevalent around the turn of the century, very influential in his thinking. Darwin's theory of evolution, very big at the time, so ideas about adaptation and survival of the fittest, very prevalent in society in which he grew up. Freud originally pursued a career as a research biologist, and you heard about the cell staining techniques and those sort of pursuits. Very interested in physiology and efforts to explain biological phenomena through physics and chemistry. And Freud's first work in the development of the central nervous system, aphasia, physiological function of cocaine, all of those pursuits in that area. But eventually Freud became very interested in neuropsychiatry, and he spent some time in 1885. He went to Paris to study with Charcot, who was doing work there on hysteria. And hysteria is basically the idea that mental disorders, that physical disorders and mental disorders might be caused by psychological rather than organic factors. And a lot of work was being done in hypnosis as a treatment for hysteria and other conditions like multiple personality and so on. So hypnosis was being used to, and basically what was happening was people were being, under hypnosis, encouraged to talk about events in their past that may have been traumatic. And in this process of talking about traumatic events, the person would experience an emotional catharsis, or release of emotion. And many times after going through this process and going through this very emotional release, then the symptoms would abide or be relieved. The person would get better. And this idea was very interesting to Freud, who didn't use hypnosis, but eventually a little bit later on, he did use the idea of people talking through traumatic or important events in their life unfiltered. So instead of hypnosis, he eventually would use his famous couch. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So Freud lived 78 years of his life in Vienna. He had 3 boys and 3 girls of his own, including Anna Freud, who became an important analyst in her own right and specialized in treating children. Freud was never a firm believer in Judaism, but he was raised Jewish. His family was Jewish, and he eventually described organized religion as an illusion used to cope with feelings of infantile helplessness. So not a devout Jew by any means, but nevertheless he was forced eventually to leave Vienna during the rise of the Nazis. Freud had a lifelong addiction to cigars, which he chain smoked basically from morning until night, constantly smoking his cigars, and he did develop cancer of the mouth and jaw. And the last 16 years of his life, he was basically in pain as a consequence, with treatment and with living with the cancer. Very painful period of his life. Freud analyzed himself for half an hour every evening, and future analysts, part of the process of becoming a psychoanalyst is to go through analysis yourself with a psychoanalyst. But if you're Sigmund Freud, you're basically writing the book. So who's going to analyze you? So Freud analyzed himself, and one of the results of that process was a book that he wrote on the interpretation of dreams, which will come up again when we talk about Adler next time. To talk about Freud's impact on counseling and rehabilitation counseling now. Psychoanalysis was basically from the 1920s and 30s through the 1950s the main form of psychological treatment in the United States. It was basically what people were doing. Flourished and developed in several areas. There are basically people who originally worked with Freud developed their own ideas, and over time other schools of thought related to psychoanalysis have emerged. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those later on. But as I said, even though this was really the theory for much of the 20th century, these days very few people associate themselves as, at least in counseling, as psychoanalysts or with the psychoanalytic theory. So the question is, again, what is Freud's impact? What is his relevance today? And some of the things that Freud did that we'll be talking about that certainly are have stood the test of time or have stayed with us are, first of all, the idea of the subconscious. Okay, not invented by Freud, not devised by Freud, but made popular by him, brought to the public awareness by him, the idea that we have a subconscious and that it acts on our conscious thought and behavior. Related idea, very much a part of our popular culture, is the idea of defense mechanisms. So things that we'll talk about and that you have heard about, like denial. A person is in denial, or rationalizing. Some of those things that we use to protect ourselves from feeling bad, basically, came out of this school of thought. The idea of talk therapy and the importance of the counseling relationship or therapeutic relationship, very much influenced by Freud and the way that he developed his approach and ideas like analysis of transference. So a lot of things we talked about today really directly relate back to Sigmund Freud and his work. Another is the idea of the importance of childhood, the idea that things that happen to us early in our development influence our current and future development. Certainly an important idea. And another of Freud's idea, the idea of free association, the use of projective tests, those sorts of ideas also directly related to Freud's work. And in terms of adaptation to disability and attitudes about disability, another area where the psychoanalytic ideas have really informed, and a lot of ideas about our attitudes about disability and people with disability were based on, and still are based on, psychoanalytic concepts. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. What we're going to do next is talk about a few of the key ideas or principles of psychoanalysis. And the first key concept is the idea that this theory is what we call a topographic theory, the idea that there is basically a subconscious, that there is human consciousness, there is awareness, and we have control to some extent of what we are aware of, but the idea that underneath the surface, at the subconscious, there are a lot of things that are going on, experiences, memories, things that we've repressed, of which we do not and cannot have awareness. So the idea that there's a lot going on outside of the awareness of which we have no control. And that's blocking the word there, but that's the idea. Topographic human consciousness is hierarchical and includes unconscious, preconscious, and conscious layers. Second key concept is that this is a developmental theory. Adult personality traits and symptoms are explained by our early life experiences and the cumulative or put together effects of biology and the things that happen to us and the way we developed as children very much influence the way we are operating today in our current functioning. Third key idea is that this is a structural theory, and we'll see that Freud described personality in terms of three structures that we will talk about and get to know in a few minutes: the id, ego, and the superego. And that personality results from the interaction of these three. Fourth key idea is that this is a dynamic interaction. So the id, ego, and superego, these energies, these drives, impulses, interact with each other and influence each other, and do so in a system. So as one gets strong, maybe others get weaker, but the change is dynamic. And actually, at the end, I'm going to tell you about some recent research that suggests that there might have been something to these ideas. Fifth key concept is the idea of economy, or it's an economic theory. Energy is made mostly of psychic and biological components. Energy that is made mostly of psychic and biological components fuels human behavior. So this energy is needed to operate the psychic structures and processes. So this idea that there is an energy underlying what we do and how that works. And then the sixth key principle, that this is an adaptive theory. In order for us to adapt and for human behavior to maintain its adaptive nature, so in other words, in order for us to survive in society, we must conform to the demands and requirements of the external social reality. So there's all this stuff going on within us, in our subconscious, that we must learn to adapt, to control to some extent, in order to survive in a society. And basically, our core tendency as humans is an attempt by the ego to maximize our instinctual gratification, in other words, to get what we want, while minimizing guilt, shame, punishment, and anxiety, and dealing with the superego, which again we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. So those are the sort of key ideas, and now we're going to go into some of these key concepts of psychoanalysis. I want to say at the beginning that, remember I said it's important that you read the textbook. But if some of these ideas seemed strange to you as you were reading them, if some of this stuff doesn't make sense to you, then I'd say you're not alone. The first time I read Freud and his ideas, I really had that sort of reaction that this stuff doesn't really make sense to me. It didn't fit my experience. So talking about young children and sexuality and some sort of ideas that seem very out there when you read about psychoanalysis. That was my initial response. But actually, what I would say is that as basically the more I learn, the more I read, and the more I live, my experience has actually sort of convinced me that Freud might have been on the right track in a lot of ways. So some of this stuff we're going to talk about does seem a little outside our current understanding and current thinking, and some of it is, but he also certainly had some ideas that have, I think, stood the test of time. So let's look at some of these ideas. The first one is the view of the person and personality. So how did Freud see people? And this is a question we'll look at in each of the theories that we study. And basically, Freud saw people as selfish and self-consumed. In other words, we're focusing on ourselves and paying attention to ourselves. And basically, we are at war with ourselves. We are dealing with an internal fight all the time, and we are aggressive and sexual even in childhood, which is an idea that, especially at the time Freud was writing about some of these ideas, was not well accepted in the popular culture. We are in a constant state of confusion, masked by a thin crust of civilization. So this idea that we look on the surface like we're okay, but basically underneath the surface we are in a constant state of confusion and conflict. We're at war between the society in which we live and the standards we have to live up to, and that pesky id who is wanting to satisfy our wishes and desires and urges. So a lot of stuff going on beneath the surface. Within this basic structure of personality, there are these three interacting systems that I mentioned: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id you can think of as the biological component, and is basically what we're born with. It's who we start with. It's our first system of personality. It is beyond conscious awareness, so we don't know the id. We aren't consciously aware of the id. The id is basically operating under the pleasure principle, which means I want to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. So anything related to physical satisfaction, comfort. If we're hungry, we want to get fed. If we're lonely or scared, we want to be comforted and protected and nurtured. We want to be comfortable and get what we want when we want it, and that's what the id is about. The second structure, the ego, which I like to think of as personality, is the psychological component, is the conscious component. So the id and the superego are non-conscious, not accessible in our conscious mind, but the ego is. It has access to the conscious and the subconscious. And the job of the ego is to adapt self to the world and finding socially acceptable ways of satisfying the id that promote self-preservation. We cannot do everything we want to do when we want to do it, and so the ego has to find a way to get what the id wants in a way that won't land us in jail or get us in trouble. And then the superego is the social component, and the superego is the rules, basically. It's the cop, it's the parent, it's the representation of rules as we understand them, as they are interpreted by people who are very important in our lives when we are younger, our parents and other people that we admire. And they interpret the rules and tell us what is okay and what is not okay. And these are introjected, put into our personality. So it is our interpretation of our parents' interpretation of the rules of society, and like I said, it's like the cop. It tells us what is okay and what is not. So you've got these three very different elements of personality, and you've got this conflict going on between them. The id wants what it wants, and the ego is trying to get it in a way that is going to work, and the superego is telling us that's not okay, you shouldn't do that, and that sort of thing. And the consequence of all this conflict is anxiety. And in the psychoanalytic view, anxiety arises when there's conflict between these three parts of our personality. The ego reacts with anxiety when we have threatening surges of instinct or impulses from the id. So when anxiety cannot be controlled, it is dealt with through the use of defense mechanisms. So we use defense mechanisms when we start to feel guilt or threat. And the defense mechanisms help to protect us from feeling guilty or anxious or bad or so on. Okay, and the characteristics of the defense mechanisms, first of all, they are unconscious. They can become conscious. You can be aware that you are in denial, for example, but they're generally they work. We don't necessarily decide that we're going to be rationalizing because we're feeling a threat. These things just happen subconsciously or unconsciously. They act by denying or distorting reality, and they are adaptive. In other words, they are helpful. They help us to cope with and gain control of and prevent emergence into consciousness of instinctual urges that threaten us or are unacceptable to us. And there are several defense mechanisms. I'm sure there are several listed in your textbook. We're just going to talk about a few of them here today. Identify and define them. The first is repression, which is sometimes referred to as defensiveness. It basically means putting away or putting down, putting out of consciousness. We repress something, we refuse to consider it. All right, so preventing inappropriate id impulses from becoming behaviors, preventing unpleasant thoughts from becoming conscious, things we don't want to think of. And we hear a lot about this in terms of repressed memories. We prevent painful memories from coming into consciousness, we repress them. Denial, when people are overwhelmed by the anxiety of a situation, we can engage in denial, and it basically is denying that the event took place. So it's a defense mechanism, that one of the ones that we are probably more familiar with. Projection In projection, anxiety is reduced by claiming another person actually has the unpleasant thoughts you are thinking. So you project onto or put onto somebody else your own thoughts. And we do this unconsciously. But for example, if you are feeling uncomfortable around, say, a person who has a particular kind of, a particular disability, let's say, and that's an uncomfortable awareness for you. You think, as a rehabilitation counselor, as the person that I am, I shouldn't be uncomfortable around this person. And so what we would do to avoid feeling like that is to put the thought onto somebody else and say that that person is uncomfortable with me. And that's easier to live with. So we project our thoughts onto somebody else. Rationalization is one of our favorites, I think. And what we do here, I'm sure you're familiar with this, is we come up with a rational reason for doing or not doing something rather than face the real reason. So if we don't want to do our reading, we don't want to do our homework, we'd rather watch television or go to a movie, but we don't like the way that makes us feel, so we rationalize and say, well, I deserve to watch this movie or watch television because I have been working so hard and I deserve a break. We tell ourselves things that make us feel better about what we did or what we did not do but should have done. Regression is going back, basically going back to an earlier developmental period. And what we do here is we generally think of this as acting like a child, going back and acting in a way that at an earlier time in our life worked for us. It got us out of trouble or got us protected when we felt threatened. So people acting in a way that was successful for them in avoiding threat when they were younger. So we regress. And displacement. Another one I think we're all sort of familiar with, this classic example of a person who gets yelled at by his or her boss doesn't feel like they can address that with the boss, so they stuff that in and they go home and they take it out on their dog or their children or some less threatening target. So we shift emotional and behavioral responses to less threatening targets, displacement.